Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the three Tiberian Wars and the plotline of Command and Conquer, the Tiberian timeline in general. I'm going to say up front, as with a lot of these, it's what I tend to do is I tend to take the as much material as primary material as I can, that is material from within the games, and I try to look at from the standpoint of someone who's a fan, but maybe not like a super hardcore fan, like someone who's played the games multiple times, who has a decent knowledge of it, but maybe isn't aware of like the behind the scenes interviews and like the deep lore and stuff that's not within the games in particular, because I generally just like to fill in the blanks myself with things that I think make sense. Uh, Kind of look at similar real world comparisons to kind of predict what it would be like in a fictional context or what direction it would go in. And I'm just going to give a bit of a disclaimer up front. The maps we're going to look at are super ghetto, and I couldn't find really good maps for most of this, and there are some reasons for that. It's kind of ironic because within Command and Conquer, most of the missions include maps. I think part of it is just because they changed so much over the course of the game, and the nature of Nod makes it very difficult to map their territory with any degree of accuracy. Also, it's just a lot of these games were made before you really had huge online fan communities. So we're going to start off with something that was not one of the three Tiberium Wars, which was World War II in the Tiberian universe. So what wound up happening that created the Tiberium universe is Albert Einstein went back in time and removed Adolf Hitler, so the Weimar Republic survived, and World War II did not happen as it did in our timeline. Instead, the Soviet Union completed its industrialization, and Stalin put together a truly massive force with the goal of world conquest, or at least a continental Soviet Union, the goal being to take China and Europe and become the dominant world power. Now, from in game, we can tell that the Soviet Union was successful in China. The exact status of China within this plotline, I'm not really sure. I'd say just because World War II never happened, and just the politics are very different, I'd say probably it's still the Republic of China, a very divided and weakened state. So the Soviets were probably able to just steamroll it. You probably had a similar situation to with Japan, where they just controlled the major cities. The Soviet Union obviously had a lot more manpower to work with than Japan, but it probably they just defeated the main field armies of the KMT. The KMT retreated to the inner of the country. The Soviets declared victory and turned their eyes to Europe. So I'm not really entirely sure how the Allies were able to win World War II. It's not even very clear in the game. From my understanding, they used like force multipliers a lot. Like they withdrew to narrow passes. They got the Soviets to overextend themselves. A big role was the chronosphere. I don't entirely understand how the chronosphere works, if it freezes time and allows units to move from one place to another, if it's like a full space time thing like in Dune. But they used that to attack behind Soviet supply lines, and it did eventually end with a victory for the United Nations, or the League of Nations, or World Association of Nations, whatever you want to call it, which at the time consisted of basically, I think, just Western Europe. It consists of Western Europe. The United States was not a member, but provided material support. I don't really get how the Allies won. The Soviets had a truly like massive number. Like if we look at this, the Allies had something like 3,400,000, and the Soviets had 14 million. And then their irregulars were like 2 million for Allies and 7 million for Soviets. It also doesn't make sense in game because the Soviets are much better. But I digress. So Russia got defeated in one timeline. I think it became, I guess, kind of a weak republic, similar to the Russian Federation today. In the Red Alert timeline, obviously, the Soviet Union remained largely intact and was reduced to kind of a puppet state ruled by Premier Romanov, and they would have a rematch during the Third World War. I think it was during the 1960s when Red Alert 2 took place, but that's not important. If you finish the Soviet campaign, you find out that Kane was secretly pulling the strings behind the Soviet Union. Now, it's not exactly clear as to whether the Tiberium universe is if the Soviets win or if the Allies win. Like, if there's a divergence in the Allied victory, like I kind of just explained, or if the Soviets win and then the Soviet Union collapses at a similar time during our timeline. Because Nadia says the Brotherhood will tire of the USSR sometime during the 90s, and then it collapsed, and then it led to the events of Tiberian Dawn. So we don't really know. All we really know is that by the time of Tiberian Dawn, Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, and it is aligned with GDI. So Tiberian had arrived on Earth from a meteorite in Italy in 1995. Now, there is a bit of a dispute. Some people say it was named Tiberium because it landed on the Tiber River. Kane claims that it was named after Tiberius Drusus Caesar, so your mileage may vary. It was around this time that the Brotherhood of Nod really started to come to the forefront. Now, I've done a separate video on the Brotherhood of Nod, but I think you can kind of think of them as a mixture of a religious organization, a like pseudo-communist mass movement, and a criminal enterprise. It's kind of a state and kind of not. It kind of straddles the line. I think maybe something like ISIS might be the best comparison, because ISIS, the goal behind ISIS was, at least theoretically, it was kind of a non-state international organization that was trying to take and hold territory, and it was trying to set up local franchises in local provinces that swore fealty to the Caliph, or I guess in this case Kane, but had a lot of autonomy. It's kind of, I think in a lot of cases, Nod was more of a brand identity. So like local communist or local, I guess, Islamist or whatever would declare themselves to be part of Nod. And they might not even really be ideologically consistent. But basically, everybody who hated the developed countries, who hated the G8, and hated the UN Security Council and that sort of thing, jumped onto the bandwagon. I don't think there's a ton of information as to how Nod built up in the second half of the 20th century. They claim that Nod goes way, way back. I think there's some indication that they played a role in World War One, because there's a lot of World War One kind of iconography, because the capital of the Brotherhood of Nod is always Sarajevo in Serbia, nowadays Bosnia, of course. But I digress. So with the arrival of Tiberium in Italy, immediately two things became apparent. One, it could be used for an unlimited, theoretically clean energy source. And the second, that it made mining very easy. So Tiberium is somewhere in between being a crystal and a plant. So it's a crystal that spreads through a root system, much like a plant, and how it functions is it leaches trace elements out of the soil, and then it can be broken down into its raw material. So I think it's like steel, copper, gold, zinc. Basically, all the various metals are combined together to form these crystals. And the crystals can be easily shattered and made into raw material. So it led to an immense economic boom throughout the world, in addition to its energy potential. So while the G8 nations were somewhat hesitant to get on board with it, and they were slow to adapt, Nod emerged as a major global power almost overnight, because they seem to have a much better knowledge of how to use Tiberium. I guess another thing, just before I forget, is Tiberium also gives off I think it's a radiation. It's a little ambiguous, but it has very strong mutagenic properties that transforms whatever it's near. In the case of plants, I think it kills them in most cases, but sometimes it'll make them into some sort of Tiberian-based plant or Tiberium-based life form. It does the same thing with animals, and eventually we'll get Tiberian fiends and like floaters and stuff like that. With regards to humans, at least early on, in most cases, it just caused severe radiation poisoning and a high rate of fatality amongst with contact with it. However, eventually some of the people exposed to it would become mutants, and they would become much stronger than normal humans, although eventually they would succumb to the poisoning from it. So as I said, Nod was very quick to take advantage of this, to use Tiberium to fund their huge enterprises and start developing their technological weapons. So as Nod became a main force, GDI was formed, the Global Defense Initiative, which is kind of, once again, this is an alternate timeline. I think you can probably best see the GDI as being NATO, but with it's kind of like the USA and Friends, or NATO and Friends, but including Russia and India and a couple other countries that aren't in NATO. And they were formed for the purpose of preventing Nod from taking over the world, I guess you could say. Now, this is the only one of the three Tiberian Wars in which nation states still existed. They would not exist by the time of the Tiberian Sun, and definitely not by the time of Tiberian Wars, where the world would just be one or another, or neutral, in which case it tended to just be an anarchic state ruled by local warlords. So what you had at the outset of the Tiberian War is Nod had large armies kind of scattered throughout the world, but GDI had the advantage of having the professional armed forces of, well, NATO plus Russia. So they started out the war with huge numbers of tanks, aircraft, helicopters, a much better global infrastructure and logistical capacity. And because they had such a huge advantage in conventional hard power, more or less to my understanding at the start of the First Tiberian War, almost every country on Earth was allied with GDI, at least theoretically, and was anti-Nod. Now, in practice, what this meant in a lot of African countries is the population would be overwhelmingly pro-Nod, and GDI would in effect only control these cities and the theoretical central government. I would imagine a lot of places there would be pro-Nod governments, but they'd theoretically swear loyalty to GDI in the West, and it would kind of leave them in a really awkward position. And I mean, you can kind of see this in the campaign, is GDI is not really sure where to attack exactly. Because even though Nod was using conventional military forces, the command structure was very decentralized and acephalous. Like if you were a Nod commander, you could be expected to manage your own logistics, recruit your own forces, build your own tanks, and you would coordinate with other Nod commanders, but you'd basically function as your own pseudo-state. Now, as I said, GDI military doctrine tends to rely on its huge industrial capacity to produce a lot of conventional weapons. So like Abrams tanks, they have an air force where Nod really doesn't in the first game. They have Orcas, which are VTOL aircraft that have anti-tank missiles on them. They have A-10 Warthogs, paratroopers, all that kind of thing. And they just focus on mass production of standardized but decent quality units. Whereas Nod has a mixture of extremely advanced technologies like lasers and chemical weapons, but also uses huge numbers of conscripts. You can see this a bit better in Tiberian Wars, in which Nod has a much more, I guess you could say, accurate force spread out, because they have like militant squads, which are just basically cannon fodder, and then they have a lot more advanced stuff like Black Hand and Scorpion tanks and that sort of thing. From my understanding, because Nod had a lot of money from its Tiberian production, it had a lot of connections to the criminal underworld, and you didn't really have to worry about civilian government. They were able to pretty well supply their forces throughout the entirety of the conflict, and Nod soldiers really didn't ever want for anything. At least that's what I've been able to find on the wiki, and that tends to be what I've seen in game. So the result, the course of the First Tiberian War is, it was kind of back and forth. The issue is, I think in this game, both campaigns are canonical. So both the Nod victory and the GDI victory happened. I forget which order they occur in. It's not, I think the Nod campaign happens first. So Nod, basically, their strategic objective was to not get wiped out and to establish themselves as a rival global superpower. And their main offensive throughout the course of the Nod campaign. So the main focus of Nod was the Africa campaign, in which they succeeded in basically overrunning all of Africa. Now, interestingly, Egypt started off as one of the most pro-GDI countries in the world, but very early on it got conquered by Nod, and it would become one of their major strong points going forward. But GDI basically got entirely kicked out of Africa. Africa became completely dominated by Nod. I think the Middle East did as well, and East Asia, particularly in China. It's not very clear because most of the game either takes place in Eastern Europe if you're GDI or Africa if you're Nod. So we don't exactly know what happened in the other countries. And once again, you have the scenario in a lot of places where the government may be nominally GDI aligned because the central government is very easy for GDI to just take out, but the population might be pro-Nod. And what exactly constitutes Nod is also, once again, very ambiguous. But the First Tiberium War would largely end with GDI in complete control of NATO countries, Europe, and not in complete control of Africa and parts of the Third World. Now, obviously, the First Tiberium War would end with Kane building the Temple of Nod in Sarajevo and GDI attacking it and succeeding in destroying it with the ion cannon. I think this game came out around the same time as GoldenEye. It's kind of interesting that both of them were created. I don't know if one necessarily copied the other, but the ion cannon is basically a orbiting satellite. Well, ion cannon. It's like a giant laser beam, and it charges up with solar energy, and then it can fire anywhere on Earth, which is extremely useful and won GDI this war by hitting the Temple of Nod in Sarajevo. So what can be said about the First Tiberium War? Who wound up winning it? I would actually argue it was a decisive Nod victory. Now, the wiki says it was a GDI victory, but I think Nod accomplished all of their strategic objectives. They didn't get wiped out. They went from being a non-state actor to controlling huge swaths of the world. And they solidified themselves as one of two global superpowers. GDI, I would call this an operational failure because while they did manage to protect Europe and the wealthier countries, which are of more strategic and economic value, they weren't able to defeat Nod. And the problem would just get worse over time because they started with de facto control of de jure control of most of the world, but they lost a lot of it in the process. And in kind of the intervening years between the First and Second Tiberium War, nation states would more or less cease to exist, and GDI would go on to form, theoretically at least, the one world government, which was kind of a mixture of civilian and military, but I think functioned more as kind of a military stratocracy or something. It's not really consistent. One of the problems with trying to do a timeline or trying to analyze any of this is that Westwood went through so many different reorganizations and the tone drastically shifted and the plot got retconned and rewritten. Like, I think Tiberian Dawn and Tiberian Sun are pretty consistent with one another, but Tiberian Wars took a really long time, and that was after EA bought them, and it just was very different tonally and in terms of what Nod's motivations were and that kind of thing. So I'm just trying to fill in the blanks myself. Now, why it could be argued that GDI won the First Tiberian War is because they destroyed Sarajevo and Kane supposedly died. So in the intervening time, let's see here, Second Tiberian War. This is like the best thing I could find that shows what the spread of what the situation looked like. So by the time of the Second Tiberian War, Nod was split into two major factions. The Eastern Hemisphere was controlled by General Hassan, who was based in Egypt, and the Western Hemisphere was controlled by General Vega, who was based in Colombia. I don't know why it shows that in Brazil on this. It's not really important. Now, it turned out that General Hassan was actually a GDI puppet, and GDI was funding him money and weapons in exchange for keeping Nod in line. So while there would still be low intensity warfare, Hassan would prevent any kind of large scale war from breaking out, and GDI was kind of able to build up their own forces and try to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe. One of the issues is Nod didn't really spend that much time or money on civilian government. And because they viewed Tiberium as being a sort of salvation tool, they weren't really interested in preventing it from spreading. Whereas GDI was trying to maintain some semblance of pre war life within their regions. So they had to, even though their economy was theoretically a lot bigger, at least in terms of industrial capacity, a lot of it went towards civilian goods and civilian government and reclamation projects, whereas Nod basically just funneled everything into its military capacity. So in the head up to the Second Tiberian War, we had the emergence of Anton Slavic, the Serbian wolf, who I believe was the head of the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a cult within a cult. It was the most hardcore religious branch of the Brotherhood of Nod, who were directly loyal to Cain. And they basically functioned as a combination of special forces, inquisition, and political police. And he was able to overthrow General Hassan and become the nominal leader of Nod within the Eastern Hemisphere. Around this time period, Cain returned, and it was announced that he didn't actually die in the events of Tiberian's son, but that he was back from the dead. Now, the fact that he returned from the dead really fueled a lot of the messianic and religious aspects of the Brotherhood of Nod, because Cain didn't look like he had aged in the 30-40 years since the previous Tiberian War, and here he was, after presumably dying, fully resurrected. We can see that Cain has very much gone from being a prophet to almost a god figure by the time of Tiberian's son, because people say in the name of Cain, Cain lives in death is a very common chant. And the goals of the Brotherhood of Nod are a lot better established in Tiberian's son. So by the point of Tiberian's son, a lot of the world has been covered in Tiberian, and the long-term destruction of humanity seems like a very real possibility. Now, GDI really wants to destroy it and kind of put things back to the way they were prior to the arrival of Tiberium, whereas Nod comes to the conclusion that the only way to adapt, or the only way to deal with Tiberium, is to adapt to it. And they come up with the concept of the divine people, which is called divination. Now, it doesn't really make sense because Ascension, which is what they call it in the third game, makes more sense as their plot in the second game, and divination, which they called in the second game, makes more sense as their plot in the third game. But basically, the goal is to dramatically accelerate the rate of Tiberian expansion, and using genetic modification, convert humanity into Tiberian-based life form that would be immortal, extremely powerful, and the I think implicit goal was to make a humanity that would be strong enough to defeat the Skrin when they would show up, who were a alien insectoid race from which Tiberian was, if not invented, was at least their primary source of life. And if you win the Nod campaign, they achieve their goal and they launch a missile into the atmosphere that transforms the entire world into, well, a Tiberian sun. Whereas, once again, GDI's goal is to maintain the status quo. So, what was the course of the Second Tiberium War? So, Anton Slavic and Cain succeeded in killing Hassan and killing Vega and reuniting all of Nod under Cain, with Slavic being his right-hand man. Nod also was able to win a major victory by building Tiberian chemical weapons and destroying large portions of Europe, which was GDI's heartland, and further expanding their influence throughout the earth. However, once again, Cain was supposedly killed when McNeil stabbed him during the ending of the the ending of the GDI campaign. And for whatever reason, he decided not to make sure that Cain was dead or take his body. So Cain went away, and he would eventually come back yet again. Now, Kane was defeated. The Brotherhood of Nod would splinter back into various groups, with local warlords taking over, and Kane's former inner circle all becoming leaders of different parts of global Nod, and Slavic lost his de facto his leadership of the organization. Although, interestingly, Kane would refer to him as his successor during the events of CNC3. During the events of Kane's Wrath. It certainly does seem like Kane intended Slavic to be his successor. If Kane was not around, then he would kind of rule as his regent. But then you have the Interwar Years, and this is where stuff starts to get really confusing, because Kane's Wrath came out after the events of CNC3, and it covers the events of post CNC2 to the beginning of CNC4. So it's kind of anachronistic, and it does a lot of retcons. So there's like a character in Kane's inner circle who he talks to during the events of CNC3, who very obviously is supposed to be Anton Slavic. But then in Kane's Wrath, they say, oh no, Anton Slavic got assassinated by this weird guy Marcian who we never see again. I tend to think that Slavic didn't get assassinated, and that part of Kane's Wrath is non-canon and is a retcon. Partially just because I really like Slavic. And it's kind of lame that he got killed off screen. I think he kind of deserved a better death, or more than like one line of dialogue, because he was probably my favorite Nod commander in the series. Anyways, so in the meantime, between the Second and Third Tiberian Wars, you had the Firestorm Crisis, where Cabal, who is Kane's personal creation and was a biomechanical computer life form that we learn at the end of the Nod campaign in Firestorm was made up of the collective intelligences of a number of different people who were hooked up to it, kind of like Sea Consciousness and Stalker, if you're kind of looking for another comparison. Cabal declared that he was the true successor to Kane, and that his goal would be to exterminate humanity and replace it with an age of machines. I don't know if that's because like the Matrix had come out around that time and they were just trying to tap into that. It didn't really make a lot of sense, but you had an incident in which GDI and Nod joined forces temporarily to defeat Cabal. And the end result of that was GDI was left with the Tacitus, which I believe is a Scrin a computer data bank that contains a lot of different information on the construction of Tiberium, or rather the usage and control of Tiberium. And in the interwar period between the second and third, GDI was able to use this to actually reclaim parts of the world from Tiberium, because they came up with resonance fields and that sort of thing. So I think you could say the Firestorm Crisis was once again a inconclusive war, which was also how I described the Second Tiberium War as a whole. Because while GDI technically won a military victory in that Nod took heavier casualties, Kane died again and they resplintered, GDI lost huge parts of its heartland and was much diminished in terms of its economic and military capacity. I think in terms of when it was strongest, GDI was probably strongest during the Second Tiberium War, as they had poured immense amounts of resources into like their mech program and their ion cannon network and their space program. And by the time of the Third Tiberian War, they'd abandoned a lot of their advanced technology in favor of much more traditional stuff. And once again, a lot of their resources had been converted back into reclamation projects. So as I said, in the interwar period between Tiberian Sun and Command & Conquer 3, Kane went underground once again. However, I think the events of Kane's Wrath show that fairly soon, like within a couple of years after the Second Tiberium War, Kane retook control again from behind the scenes. And when he was able to retake control, he got Nod a lot more ready over a longer period of time than he previously had. So I think on the dawn of the Third Tiberium War, Nod and GDI were roughly at parity in terms of the military forces, which is kind of a first in history. Because normally Nod it had a lot of advantages, but I don't think it was ever really able to bring the sheer size and firepower that GDI was in terms of its field armies. I view the Third Tiberium War as the case in which Nod made its full-on push for global world domination, where the goal was actually, and that was kind of the approach undertaken by Killian Qatar and some of the more, I guess you could say, pragmatic or nationalist members of Nod. By this point in time, the religious aspect of it had kind of become weird because there's this whole idea of ascension that emerged that replaced divination, whereas the goal wasn't to become like the rulers of the earth, but to ascend to a higher plane, or in this case, another planet, because we really play up the alien angle in this game. So, Nod starts off with a series of offensives. I believe the major one was somewhere around here, where they were attacking and they managed to overrun Washington, D.C., and the rest of what remained of the United States of America. From my understanding, the president of GDIs operated out of the White House, and they tried to maintain the fiction that America was still a country. I'm not sure if some of these countries still existed on paper, but at this point, GDI was the de facto world government, and I don't think anyone took the concept of national sovereignty seriously. As kind of a side note, while I generally am skeptical of the idea of world government, I think in this case they really didn't have much of a choice, because they kind of needed to shepherd all of humanity's remaining resources if they wanted to any of the world to survive for any length of time. One of the issues, though, leading up to the Third Tiberium War is GDI's resonance technology had begun to fail, and once again, Tiberian contamination had begun to spread. So this brings us to the world map, which once again, due to the nature of Nod, it's almost impossible to come up with an actual world map. So rather than GDI versus Nod, the main map we have from this time period is zones. So blue zones you can think of as being first world countries. They have very little Tiberian infection. People there largely live normal lives. Obviously, it's more militarized than it would be in our timeline, but they're generally speaking pretty nice. There's a variety of reasons for why they are where they are. Tiberian spreads slower across the ocean and in cold climates, hence why so much of the north is blue. Also, they were areas that were wealthy to begin with, or relatively easy to keep clean. Like, obviously Madagascar is not a wealthy country, but the fact that it's an island made it more difficult for Tiberian to spread to there. So those, I think, are 100% controlled by GDI. The yellow zones are areas that are infected, violent, or in a constant state of warfare. I think most of them is either controlled by Nod or has very strong Nod influence. I think there probably is nominal GDI control over a substantial amount, particularly in the area surrounding the blue zones. So as I was saying, Nod had built up a truly massive conventional army, and they had continued their technological development, whereas GDI had been largely stagnant. So initially, Nod won a lot of victories. However, once again, the reckless nature of Nod's tactics, the fact that Kane was not, despite what he said, was not primarily focused on winning the conventional war, was kind of the main reason that Killian Qatar lost faith in him, because her continued goal throughout was that Nod should attempt to form a world government, and then they could worry about their grander plans as they could shepherd all the resources of the blue zones towards fighting towards their various super projects. Now, in the middle of the war, as the tide was beginning to turn against them, Nod was able to convince GDI director Edmund Boyle to fire a ion cannon at a massive liquid Tiberium bomb that had been placed under the Sarajevo temple. Oh, I forgot to note that the event that set off the Third Tiberium War was basically all of the GDI political and military leadership, aside from Redmond Boyle, played by Billy D. Williams, who is the treasurer and a really greedy, corrupt politician, were on the Philadelphia, which was GDI's orbiting command center, for an energy summit, and Nod had blown it up, which basically had decapitated GDI and made them very slow to respond. sorry, back to what I was talking about. So the ion cannon hit the liquid Tiberium bomb and created an immense explosion, which destroyed a lot of what was left of Europe. But more importantly, it called the Skrin, the aliens who presumably invented Tiberia, into Earth. Now, the Skrin apparently knew who Cain was, and I think Cain was initially supposed to be the biblical Cain and was supposed to be a supernatural figure, but that got retconned and now he's an alien. And the Skrin seem to be aware of him and know who he is from a previous encounter. So then we have a Skrin invasion of the Earth, and the Skrin weren't really expecting much of a fight because normally they only detect stuff like the Tiberian eruption once the planet's been completely rendered inhabitable. So instead, they had to basically rely on their security forces that they brought with them. And they started attacking both GDI and Nod. Cain was presumably killed during the Sarajevo explosion, in which case Killian Qatar took over and formed a short-term alliance with GDI with the goal of defeating the Skrin, as as basically they're both human factions, and they both want to rule the world, as it were. And if there is no world, or if aliens control it, there's really not much they could do. So they succeeded in doing a lot of damage to the Skrin, but the Skrin were building threshold towers that, when complete, would open up portals to other civilization, to other planets, which was part of Cain's ultimate plan. So ultimately, they managed to destroy most of the threshold towers. Killian Qatar got framed as a traitor by Alexa Kovac, I think her name is. Was it? It's Alexa something or other. One of Cain's other blonde lieutenants. So she got killed, despite the fact that she had been leading Nod and had a lot more success than Cain did. So it's kind of confusing after this point. I think GDI and Killian Qatar's Nod managed to destroy all the threshold towers except for one in Italy. And you had a big final battle there, and Nod was able to allow it to be completed, and it put up a shield or armor or something and was indestructible. So the Third Tiberium War ends with Nod being completely defeated in a conventional military victory. All their military forces were destroyed. They could no longer even operate openly within their former yellow zones. And GDI was left in more or less total control of the Earth. All the populated parts were now at least under nominal GDI control. Nod was hiding in bunkers somewhere, but they had succeeded in getting the one threshold tower. So I would call the Third Tiberium War like a decisive GDI victory. And while I think you could call the first one a Nod victory and the second one inconclusive, GDI definitively won this one, and Nod was so devastated they would never really pose a major threat to GDI again in a military sense. And that brings us to the events of Command & Conquer 4, which doesn't make any sense. Basically, GDI is no longer able to keep the Tiberian at bay. I think something like 99% of the Earth gets covered with Tiberium. Cain shows up, and after Cain shows up, he's like, look, you need to build the Tiberium control network. The Tiberium control network, its effect will be that it will allow you to destroy Tiberium at will and provide an unlimited clean energy source. So GDI and Nod work together to build the Tiberium control network. Gideon, who's like some evangelical Nod preacher, launches a coup d'etat, and he works with hardline GDI elements because they both hate Nod. You have, I don't even really want to talk about CNC4. I'm just bringing it up because it's the theoretical end of the franchise. So ultimately, Cain is able to activate the Tiberium control network. All of Nod gets transferred to some other dimension or some other planet, and GDI is now able to reclaim the entirety of the Earth, with Nod completely defeated and removed, and Tiberium now under control. So I guess you could say it's a happy ending. There's left a bit of wiggle room at the end where some people were very dismissive and said, Cain gone, yeah, right. He'll be back again someday like Frosty the Snowman. And we'll never know if anything additional would happen or what the original plans were, because EA LA closed after that because CNC4 was such a clusterfuck. We can talk about that some other time, but CNC4 was such a total disaster. The franchise died after that. And we'll never really know if there was going to be something else. Because, I mean, there still is a bit of a cliffhanger. The Skrin are still out there. Who knows if Kane is really gone for good? Um, a lot of questions kind of needed to be answered. I mean, I guess it's nice that the war finally got resolved, and the Tiberian question, the TQ, got resolved. But overall, it was just a very disappointing ending. So that kind of brings us to the end of the three Tiberium Wars. I'm sorry this was so long, but there was a lot of ground to cover. I was just trying to kind of provide an overview of what happened, who won each conflict, kind of what the politics were. Once again, I'm trying to cover like 20 plus years of games, and like, I guess it would be like like four games, maybe five if we include Red Alert, and then all the respective expansion packs. So I think I did an okay job. I haven't done a sci-fi pulse in general. I'm going to try to get back to making them. I hope you enjoyed it. God bless, and I'll talk to you all later.